Roads almost always change the hydrology and they result in some inundation of areas. And so this is in the central Amazon. You can see quite a few trees here have been flooded by the impeded water from the road, and that's killed those trees in that particular area. Also, there can be a lot of sedimentation and erosion associated with roads. If it's paved, you don't get as much erosion on the road surface itself. But unpaved roads and also the verges or the sides of the roads can have a lot of sedimentation. Typically, in a logging operation, in a selective logging operation where there's quite a lot of road building, we will see something like 10,000 times as much sediment in the streams after the logging operation as compared to before the logging operation. That's a pretty typical kind of number. So rainforest streams normally are very clean if there's not much disturbance, but if you disturb the soil, you can get a huge increase in erosion and in sedimentation in the streams. So that can be a significant impact. Of course, some things are killed by vehicles. If there's a lot of traffic, if the traffic is moving fast, many species can be killed. And we know that there are certain kinds of species that are more vulnerable than others. Things that tend to be moving slow, things that don't see very well. A lot of species, particularly at nighttime, will freeze and they'll just stop and look at a car and they won't move out of the way. Other things forage along roads. Some species, reptiles, some amphibians, bask on roads. Other things migrate and are very vulnerable. So there's a variety of different kinds of species that can just be killed by vehicle traffic. Then also, for some species, particularly for some of the really specialized forest species, roads and the road clearings can actually form barriers. And this is surprising because typically, when we're talking about roads or highways, we might only be talking about a clearing that might be 30 meters, 40 meters, 50 meters, 60 meters wide, typically not huge clearings, but even that is enough to completely stop the movements of some species. My wife, for her PhD, when she was studying some of these understory birds, some of the more specialized species, they found that they could put a radio transmitter on the bird. And these are birds that have a very, very strong affinity for their territory. They spend their whole life on the territory and they have one mate. They mate with another bird for their entire life. That's the typical strategy with these birds. And you can catch a bird off the territory and you can move it 1 or 2 kilometers inside the forest and it will be back to its territory within a day or sometimes 2 days. But they always, or virtually always, come back to the territory. You can take that same bird and not move it far away at all, just maybe 60 or 70 meters across a road, and it will not go back to its territory. Okay? This is a bird that has an incredibly strong affinity for its territory. It's a bird that has a lifelong mate, and it will not go back. That illustrates how powerful these clearings can be in terms of influencing the behavior of the species. They can, for some very specialized species, actually fragment their populations. So that's an important thing to realize for some, and particularly in tropical environments where we see a lot of these habitat and microhabitat specialists. Roads can also be very important corridors for invasions. There's a lot of species that will move along, generalist species and exotic species that will use the disturbed habitats and the road margin habitats to invade new areas. In the central Amazon, where we do a lot of work on forest fragmentation, we see a number of frogs and insects and other species that use the roads themselves to invade areas that are way out in the middle of the Amazon. And it's the only way that they could be getting out there is by moving along road verges. And you see this again and again for many species of plants, many species of weeds, using roads for invasions. Then we get into the indirect effects, or the secondary effects of roads. And one of the obvious things is hunters. You get a lot more hunting when you have road building operations. This is one of the big things that we see in tropical logging operations, is that when a frontier area gets opened up by loggers, oftentimes you get many hunters. The loggers themselves oftentimes are hunters, and you can get a big increase in hunting activity for some species. This is some work that we did in Central Africa, and it's showing, and this is an area where there's actually very few people and very light hunting pressure, but even so, this is within a protected area. This is showing the responses of forest elephants to an area outside of a reserve where there was some, or sorry, an area inside a protected area where there was not much hunting, but still they tended to decline in abundance near roads. And outside the protected area, there was a sharper response. Again, this is in an area where there's not much hunting and not very many people at all. If you actually look at wider areas of Africa, Central Africa, many areas have a much higher human population densities and more people. These are some data that were put together by Steve Blake and colleagues in a major study. This here, we're looking at changes happening. This is 0 to 5 kilometers from a road. And this is moving all the way up to 60 kilometers from a road. And you can see, as you get closer and closer to roads, these are human signs. So this is things like snares, shotgun shells, boot prints, machete marks, the marks that people make in the forest. And there's a big increase in human activity as you get closer to roads. And there's a big decline in elephant abundance. Okay, a very sharp decline in elephant abundance as you get closer and closer to roads. This is, if you model that relationship and you look at where the roads are and how the elephants respond to roads, what you see is that traditionally much of equatorial Africa would have been good habitat for forest elephants. And today, obviously, the refugia, the areas where they're safe from hunting, are much, much more restricted. And in fact, over the last 10 years, there's been an approximately 60 to 70% mortality of forest elephants. 60 to 70% of all the forest elephants in Central Africa have been killed in the last 10 years. Illegal mining is a very big problem. You know, if you go onto YouTube and you look in places like Peru, or in Suriname, or Ghana, or Indonesia, or in the Caipo Reserve in Brazil, there are all these videos showing people are doing this more and more, flying in airplanes over areas and showing the incredible number of gold miners, illegal gold miners that are coming in some cases destroying tens of thousands of hectares of riparian areas and land in these areas. And it's the roads are providing the corridors by which these illegal gold miners are invading many different areas. Of course, loggers both create roads and use roads, and so logging is very much a part of the whole frontier dynamic of road expansion all through the world. And so logging is a huge part of this issue. Selective logging in and of itself does not destroy forests, but again, it often opens up forests for other kinds of activities. Roads tend to increase forest fires. And you can see this in many different ways. For instance, here in northern Bolivia, if you see these areas in dark, these are roads, and you can see the areas in red, these are forest fires. And you don't have to stare at that very long to see there's a very strong correlation between where the roads are and where the fires are. These are some data by Marilyn Anini, who comes out of Stuart Pinn's lab at Duke University. This shows, you see here, this is distances away from a road, so this is 0 to 10 kilometers, 10 to 20 kilometers, etc., on up to 40 to 50 kilometers. This is the increase of fire frequency as you get closer and closer to roads in the Brazilian Amazon. So there's a dramatic increase in fires as you get closer and closer to roads. This is inside parks and protected areas. So we're getting fewer fires, but still there's an increase in fires as you get closer to roads, even inside protected areas in the Brazilian Amazon. And of course, just outright deforestation. There's a very strong association between where the roads are and where the deforestation occurs. We just had a paper come out in Biological Conservation where we showed that 95% of all deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon occurs within 5 kilometers of roads. And this is actually one of the reasons that we were able to define this that precisely is we were also able to detect all the illegal roads, or virtually all of the illegal roads, as well as all the official roads. And so when you put all those roads into your GIS model, you see an extremely tight relationship between where deforestation happens and where the roads are. So it just simply illustrates how important roads are. We published a paper some years ago now asking what would happen to the Brazilian Amazon, where the government back in 2000 proposed a gigantic assemblage of different projects, a tsunami of new highways and roads and power lines and and gas lines and hydroelectric dams and other infrastructure in the Brazilian Amazon. And we asked what would happen to the Amazon if all of those projects that were proposed actually happened, and if deforestation and degradation happened along those roads as it has happened in the past in the Amazon. And we ended up producing a couple of different models here. And I think these shocked a lot of people because what you could see is not only if all those projects proceeded, and many of them have in fact proceeded or are proceeding now, but not only would there be continuing deforestation in the Amazon, but also fragmentation of the Amazon on a very large spatial scale. And we know that these fragments of forest are much more vulnerable to predatory logging and to wildfires and to other kinds of changes in the future. So there was a lot of concern about what this kind of thing, and it's mostly being driven by road expansion, okay? Particularly roads that are going right out, penetrating right out into the deep wilderness areas and right into the heart of the Amazon. So a real problem that we're facing today is obviously roads are playing a very profound effect in determining the pattern and the pace of destruction or environmental degradation. But part of the problem is there's just so many roads. Everywhere we look, there are new roads going in, and there are people that focus on trying to study and to predict the impacts of roads and to plan roads and to mitigate the impacts of roads. And these environmental planners, in many cases, are just overwhelmed. They feel like the little Dutch boy in the dike, trying to put their fingers in all the holes that are leaking from the dike, but there's just so many holes appearing that they can't stop the onslaught. And so this is really a serious problem. So bearing this in mind, we proposed last year, this is with Andrew Balmford at Cambridge, we proposed that we needed to attack this problem differently. Rather than just trying to study and mitigate and plan roads one road at a time, we needed a global plan. We needed a scheme that could try to zone and prioritize where roads should go and where roads should not go, integrating a much broader set of information. Now, we're well aware, I'll just say right now, we're very well aware of how ambitious, and some people might even say laden with hubris, a scheme like this is, but we'll talk about it and you can see what it is we're attempting to do. The problem, of course, with publishing a paper like this in which you say we need to do it is then, unfortunately, you have to do it. So we've spent much of the last year working on this and putting this together. So there's quite a team of collaborators that are involved in this. Many of these are my postdocs at James Cook University. We also have agricultural specialists from Minnesota and Harvard University, Andy Balmford and Ben Phelan at Cambridge, and other researchers at the Conservation Strategy Fund at the University of Melbourne in Australia. All of these people, they have very different skills: spatial modelers, road specialists, agricultural specialists, a wide variety of different sets of skills. So we have two basic goals in this particular project. And the first is to say, where are roads a really bad idea? Where are roads most likely to cause serious environmental damage? And one of the immediate conclusions that you draw is that roads that penetrate into wilderness areas, that where you don't have roads, those are among the most damaging roads you can possibly have. Because for one thing, deforestation is very spatially contagious. It tends to spread like a cancer, okay? So you put a new road in, and the deforestation tends to spread right away from that road. The other thing that tends to happen is that the first road tends to generate networks or spider webs of secondary and tertiary roads, okay? So you put a first road in, and then you tend to get all these additional roads coming off that, and then other roads coming off that. So the point is, it's that first cut that's the critical thing. And if we're going to try to manage and maintain some wilderness areas in the future, we've really got to try to stop that first cut wherever we possibly can. So that's one of the priorities. The second is we need to say, obviously we can't say, well, we can't have any more roads. We're living in a world in which there's tremendous change happening. We're going to have more roads. So where can roads be built to have the greatest benefits for humankind, for human welfare? And now there are many, many different reasons that people build roads, and you can't realistically model and consider all of those. But what we did want to consider was food demand and agriculture, because this is one of the biggest changes we know we're going to be facing in the future. The world's population is growing. We're probably going to have about 9 billion people by the middle part of this century and 10 or 11 billion people by the end of this century. Global food demand is expected to double by the middle part of this century, and it's going to be an incredible challenge to produce enough food for the world in that time frame. There are different projections. If you ask how much additional land do we need to have to convert into agriculture than what we have right now, the numbers are hugely variable. On the one hand is an estimate from some food, on the one hand is an estimate from David Tillman and colleagues at the University of Minnesota, and basically this is sort of a business as usual scenario. They say if we're going to more or less do agriculture the way that we're doing it now, we're going to need about 1 billion hectares of additional farmland by the middle part of this century. That's an area about the size of Canada. That's an incredible amount of additional land that will have to be converted if we continue to do agriculture the way that we're doing it right now. The other extreme of the estimates is an estimate of 120 million hectares, which is made by a group of experts at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. And their assumption is much more optimistic, and because they assume that agriculture, that we're going to get much, much better in our agriculture, especially in developing countries. For instance, in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where there's a lot of smallholder farming, and a lot of that farming is actually not particularly efficient. There's a large gap between what you could be producing on that land if you had fertilizers, if you had irrigation, if you had better farming technology, if you had probably larger farms, typically, if you had modern varieties of crops, if you have the various things that more modern types of farming techniques have, oftentimes there can be quite a dramatic increase in food production. And so if there is an increase in food production, you don't need as much to convert as much land. Now it turns out that there are large areas of the earth where most of the native vegetation has already been removed. In sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Andes, parts of Latin America, parts of Asia, many examples of this, but where agriculture is not currently as efficient as it could be. And so the idea is that one of the key things that you need in order to improve the agriculture is better roads. In many cases, there are poor roads, there's not road paving, it's very difficult to get your crops to market, there's a lot of wastage of crops, getting crops to market. In other cases, it's very difficult for farmers to get fertilizers because it's just so expensive because of the transportation costs. Farmers don't have much contact with areas where they can learn about new farming techniques. And so one of the ideas is that one of the areas where we would like to, oftentimes would like to see more road building is where most of the native vegetation has already been removed and where there's agriculture, but the agriculture is not very efficient. Now, I don't want to pretend that this won't have these kinds of changes. And this is better roads and more roads in these areas will not by themselves improve agriculture. You also need the better cultivars, the better varieties of crops. You need to have the fertilizer. You may need to have irrigation. You need to have better farming technologies. But the roads are often a very critical part of this process of improving agriculture. The possible advantage of this is that if you improve the roads into a particular area, oftentimes those areas become very popular with farmers. The land prices tend to rise, the production tends to rise, rural farmers tend to become more prosperous, and those areas can, in some circumstances, start to act like magnets. They can start drawing in people from frontier areas and other areas where they may be doing a lot of deforestation, and trying to draw them into these areas where you're trying to intensify and focus agriculture rather than having it spreading out over an area of 1 billion hectares. So this is the idea behind this. Is instead of clearing an area the size of Canada, 1 billion hectares, we might only have to clear an area the size of South Africa, 120 million hectares, if in fact we can see major improvements in agriculture. That's sort of the theory. So this is our global road mapping scheme. It's in Press and Nature now, so it'll be coming out. And those of you who published in Nature know what's involved in that kind of thing. It's a gigantic battle to get something in there, but we've finally done it. But we have two basic categories. We have an environmental values layer, which looks at things like biodiversity, key habitats, and environmental services. And then we have another layer which describes road benefits, and this is focusing on areas where most of the vegetation has already disappeared. It's suitable for farming, but there's a large gap between the current production and what could be produced if the agriculture was better in these areas. These are areas that are projected to have large increases in production in the future because of population growth or because their export markets are increasing, and also they're accessible to markets. Well, I'll show you a little bit more about all these different layers. So I'm going to do this a little bit quickly, but these are the different layers of information that we put into our model. The number of threatened vertebrate species, so you can see that the world, species that are imperiled and endangered are not evenly distributed on the Earth. We see lots in Southeast Asia, we see some parts of Africa, we see lots right here in the Colombian Andes, in the Choco area, places like that, really hot spots of endangered species. So there are, these are areas that are prioritized. Another thing that we looked at are areas that have lots of plant species. So again, we see, you guys are living right here in just about the biologically most important real estate on the planet, along with maybe some places here in Southeast Asia and some small parts of Africa. But these are the centers of plant diversity. So we can put those two layers together and we come up with a biodiversity map. Okay, so that's one component that goes into our environmental benefits layer. We also then included some other things, the biodiversity hotspots, which are 35 areas of the world, you probably all know this, that where you have lots of endemic species and where most of the native vegetation has already been destroyed. So these are habitats that are very critical for nature conservation, for conserving biodiversity. Also, endemic bird areas and important bird areas. These are areas where bird watchers recognize as having locally endemic species, or they may be very important migratory corridors or critical habitats in other ways, but these have been well mapped out in many parts of the world. We have the Global 200 terrestrial ecoregions, which were put together by WWF, and which identify very important, iconic ecosystems on the planet in different parts of the world. We have frontier forests and major wilderness areas. These are the world's great wildernesses that would hopefully survive in the long term. All these are the largely contiguous expanses of habitat. So we put those layers together and we average them all out and we come up with a composite key habitat map. So this is showing us where on the Earth we have really critical habitats for biodiversity and for wilderness. And then the third component of our environmental values layer is a map of environmental services. And we've got two layers, two things that we're looking at here. Carbon, okay, so this is the amount of carbon emissions. This estimates how much carbon emissions will be released into the atmosphere as greenhouse gases if you destroy the native vegetation and you replace it with whatever the locally prevailing crop is. So here in Colombia, if you were in the Meta area, it might be cattle ranching or it might be oil palm. In Brazil, it might be soya. In other parts of the world, it might be slash and burn farming, whatever. But the bottom line is, it's an estimate of how much carbon emissions are likely to be produced by conversion. And finally, not really time to explain this, but an estimate of the impact of deforestation or land use change on the local climate. So for example, if you compare a tropical rainforest in Indonesia and you look at the temperature and then you compare that with the temperature of an oil palm plantation, you find that oil palm plantation on average is about 5 degrees centigrade warmer, okay? Now for people that live in those areas, that difference of 5 degrees centigrade is a very unpleasant difference, and it affects diseases, it affects agriculture, it affects the livability of these areas. And so this is basically asking, if you remove the native vegetation, what kind of impact do you have on the local environment in terms of things like temperature and humidity and evaporation in the environment, which tends to improve the livability of the area. So you put those two things together and you get this composite biodiversity services map. And then so we have three things. We have a biodiversity layer, we have a critical habitat layer, and then we have this environmental services layer. We put all three of those together, and this is our map, our attempt to say where on the Earth are the natural values really important? Okay, and we know that things are not evenly distributed. There's some parts of the world that are much more important than others. You guys here in Colombia happen to live in some very, very important habitats, but also in other parts of the world as well, including some of the higher latitude forests, some of the Mediterranean environments. But the tropics really do stand out as being extremely important. If you guys got together in a team and did this, you'd come up with a different system. But having played around with these data for a while now, I suspect that your map would be broadly similar to the map that we produced. That's our effort, yeah. And then on top of that, we also included data on protected areas, because basically, the view is roads that go into protected areas are going to do things like increase hunting, in many cases increase land use encroachment, increase roadkill, fragmentation of populations, and so ideally, we prefer not to have roads within protected areas, so we also put in a layer on protected areas as well. Then we start asking, well, where should roads go? What kinds of things would determine where roads go? So again, we want to focus on areas where most of the native vegetation has already been removed, so we're not destroying a lot of additional vegetation, so that's one layer in the map. We want areas where there's large yield gaps, okay, so there's a large difference between what's being produced now with agriculture and what could be produced if there were agricultural improvements. We also want to focus on areas where there's likely to be a big increase in agricultural demand or food demand in the future. You can see here particularly some places like sub-Saharan Africa where there's projections of very dramatic population growth. Africa's population is likely to increase by about 400% this century. Okay, we're going to have 4 times as many people living in Africa as occur there today. Also, it includes other areas where there's projected to be large increases, not so much because of population growth, but because of globalization and because of export markets and that type of thing. This includes all those factors. Unfortunately, the data are quite coarse. They're at the national level, but still it's important to have that in the model. We also included access to markets because even if you had good agricultural systems right in the center of the Amazon or in the middle of the Sahara Desert or someplace very remote, it still wouldn't be a very good place to intensify agriculture because you'd be maybe 500 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers away from any kind of major urban market. And the transportation costs would just be too high. It would not make the agriculture desirable. So what we want to do is you actually want to have the intensification happening in areas that are closer to where people are currently living or where people are going to be living more in the future, because that's where the demand is really going to increase. And then finally, we also included the soil fertility and climate suitability. So what we did is, even if some areas came out as being desirable for road improvements, if those areas, for instance, some of the Miombo habitats in southern Africa have very poor soils. Some places, obviously, like the Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula, have climates that are not very good for agriculture. So those are not areas where we would expect to see much agricultural increases just because they're not physically or in terms of their soils very, very suitable. So we put all that information together and we get this red map here. And this is basically, it says where on the earth are roads likely to give benefits for improving agricultural production. Okay? So you can see there's a lot of red there. There's a lot of variation in the tones of red, but there's still a lot of red. So we have these 2 different layers. We have a layer of environmental values, and we have a layer which says area of environmental values where we don't want to see very many more roads. And then we have an area of potential road benefits where roads can really have major benefits for humanity and for food production. So we then try to put these 2 things together and say, well, what does the world look like? And what we've done here is categorize the world. This is a very simplified version, but we just said, let's put everything into 4 basic categories. So if you're green, that means you have above median values for your environmental values, and you have below median values for the road benefits layer. In other words, these are areas where you've got a lot of environmental value and you're not going to get a lot of agricultural benefit from building roads. So these are areas where we would hopefully not see roads happening very much. Then we have areas that are red, which are the opposite. These are areas that have lower environmental values, where you get a lot of benefit from road building. Then we have areas that are black. Black are what we call conflict areas, because these are areas where you have both high environmental values and you can get high benefits from road building in terms of agricultural benefits. And you can see lots of black on the planet. And then finally we have white. These are lower priority areas or lower tension zones that have both low environmental values and lower benefits from roads. Okay, so extremely simplified global zoning scheme here, but at a very superficial level, it gives you a sense of where roads could have benefits, where roads could be very problematic, and where we're likely to see a lot of conflicts in the future. Now, I mentioned we also include protected areas, so if we overlay that, so that's without protected areas, that's with protected areas, that changes the map somewhat because, again, these protected areas are places that we don't want to see road building. And certainly if there is road building, you prefer it not to go right through the heart of the protected area. You would hope it would be more along the margins. We know there will be road building in protected areas, but again, in the scheme, we're trying to come up with a zoning map. Now that is again, still a very simplified map in the sense that we've only categorized the world into 4 different categories. You know, green, red, black, and white, okay? Now in reality, the layers are much more nuanced. There's much more variation. And so when you actually talk about using a map like this for real road planning, let's say you want to use it for Colombia, you do 2 things. One is that, firstly, you'd use much more subtle colors. This is, instead of having 4 categories, we now have 100 categories, okay? We now have 10 different categories of natural values, and we have 10 different categories of agricultural benefit or road benefit. And so we have 100 different categories here, and you can see a lot more subtlety, a lot more nuance in these colors. The other thing, of course, is that we would zoom in at much more higher resolution. And so we've produced these maps, and they're all going to be readily available. We've set up a special website as soon as the paper's published. If you wanted to get these maps for Colombia, or for the Brazilian Amazon, or for the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Indonesia, or whatever, it'll all be available there, high resolution. But the idea is to take these maps, we hope that these maps can be at least part of the conversation when people talk about roads, and then what they will do, surely, is integrate them with more information. There'll be better and finer scale information on lots of things that you would have at the national scale, but which are not available at a global scale. But anyway, and then if you start looking at some of these maps, you see some interesting patterns. I mean, one of the things that falls out, much of Southeast Asia is very high conservation priority, and also lots of conflict areas. One of the good bits of news is that there's large areas in India where we can have more agricultural production increases without huge environmental costs. There are some very biologically important parts of India, but there's also, given India's gigantic population and the fact that it's still growing quite rapidly, that's some good news. Here's a map of Latin America. You see huge expanses. I mean, there's really a bias towards green in South America, especially in the greater Amazon region and in the Andes, because these are areas where the environmental values are extremely high, and where in many cases, not in the Andes, but in the Amazon basin, where the soils are quite poor, and so the conditions for agriculture are not very good. Although those can be overcome with enough fertilizer and other constraints. But we also see a lot of conflict areas, and again, looking here, for instance, at northern and South America, the Andes, the Choco region, massive potential for conflict in the future with conflicts between agriculture and between environmental values. And then probably the place where we're seeing the most conflict is sub-Saharan Africa. Some areas like the Sahel have considerable potential for agricultural improvements, but a lot of environmental values, Madagascar, sub-Saharan Africa, areas where we're projected to see massive population increases. And also, there's just a feeding frenzy of investment in Africa right now with China and European, North American, and Brazilian, Australian, many other corporations, many other governments are in, especially for mining, but that mining money is driving a lot of infrastructure expansion, and that infrastructure expansion and the roads are driving a lot of environmental change. So we're likely to see a lot of changes. In sub-Saharan Africa just looks like an area where there's going to be incredible change for the future. So I'm calling this preliminary conclusions because still, this is a very ambitious effort to try to, look at global scale patterns and to draw out some things. I think the really interesting work will come later when we start looking at specific nations and specific regions and trying to bring this approach in and applying it, and then I think we'll be able to make more firm conclusions. But some general conclusions, every continent has substantial areas where the good news is every continent has substantial areas where there's the potential to increase agriculture without a lot of without giant environmental costs. So that's really the good news. However, the bad news is there are a lot of conflict zones across the planet. Right here, Northern and South America. I mean, this is a huge area of conflict. Sub-Saharan Africa, large parts of Southeast Asia, some of the Mediterranean regions. I mean, there are many different parts of the world where conflicts are likely to arise. Just a couple of regional trends that I've already mentioned, that the Amazon region really comes out as mostly green because the environmental values are so extremely high there, and because the potential benefits of large-scale agriculture are limited. A place like India really does look like it has large potential for yield increases, which is very good news for India. So sort of the bottom line take-home messages from this: the last surviving wildernesses on the planet are under assault right now. In our lifetimes, we are seeing most of these last wildernesses being profoundly changed. And it's usually roads, which are the critical first step in the transformation and the degradation and destruction of these wilderness areas. And the unbridled, explosive expansion of roads is just such a critical factor. People talk a lot about land sparing, about sparing land for agriculture by improving agricultural yields. And if we have better agriculture, we'll be able to spare land for nature. But in fact, that's only half of the problem, okay? Yes, we need better agriculture, but on the other side of the coin, if we just have good agriculture, that just becomes more profitable. If we look at something like oil palm is tremendously profitable, and it is spreading everywhere across the world right now, okay? The land sparing will only happen if we improve agriculture on one hand, but on the other hand, we need to have land use zoning, we need to have land use planning, we need to have environmental enforcement, we need to have a plan for deciding what areas are going to be exploited, what areas are going to be developed, and what areas are not. And that is where this kind of scheme, which is trying to prioritize roads where they should and shouldn't go, will hopefully gain some kind of traction. So, thank you.
Damos una ronda de 5 preguntas si existen, y después de esta tenemos tiempo para otra pregunta.
Yeah, Bill. Does your model include cattle in agriculture? And the other question is, how do you think we could combine politicians?
Yeah.
Because it's a key part.
Yeah.
If we don't combine politicians, that's important.
Yeah.
It's a good model. Good for you.
Yeah. Well, so yes, it does include grazing land, pastoral and grazing land. So yes, cattle and other livestock are included in the model. How do we convince the politicians? Well, that's the next stage. I think we've got to have a stronger focus. Look, I'm not saying roads are the only important thing in the world, but I'm just saying that roads play a very, very profound impact as a proximate factor in determining the pattern and the pace of environmental change. So I think firstly we need to have more dialogue about roads, and there's a very strong prevailing mindset in many countries that roads are good. You talk to economists, roads are good, and roads are. Roads are one of the most cost-effective ways to promote economic growth, to increase regional integration. I mean, there are reasons why roads are being built. But one of the reasons why they are so good for economic growth is because they facilitate exploitation of natural resources, which often leads to a Pandora's box of environmental problems. So it's trying to have a balance. And I think we do have to we need a louder dialogue, and we need to have the scientists being more a part of the conversations. Because I've been involved, particularly in places like the Amazon, on a lot of discussions about roads, and these discussions are dominated by ministries that are involved in transportation and environmental, economic issues, and other ministries. The ministries for the environment, Ministry for the Environment, are oftentimes very marginalized. They're very small players. So what we're hoping with a scheme like this is at least you put it on the table and you say, look, this area is bright green, and from the very beginning, at least we should be talking in a cautious way about putting roads into an area like this. I mean, that's what we're hoping to do, is to help influence the dialogue. But we're not naive enough to think that, you know, this is going to be anything easy or simple at all, because it's just not, you know. And, but at least, you know, we need to really get people's attention focused on roads, because I think they're one of the most critical changes we're seeing happening. And this is the most explosive era of road expansion in human history, okay? By 2050, we'll have 60% more roads than we have right now. There's never been any time in the 5 billion year history of the planet Earth where roads have been built more rapidly than they're being built right now.
Well, it was really interesting, thank you. I wonder if you can include in your model not only roads, but like the communication network. Because I think what will happen in Colombia is this. You have the Andes, where we have roads. And you have the Amazon, where the roads are the rivers. And I think the most possible outcome in the Amazon is to start using the rivers. Yeah. And the politicians will say, okay, we will not build roads because you have all the problems, but we will start using the rivers and manage more river transportation. That at the end will have the same impact, getting people there or whatever. So how do you...
Yeah. Well, traditionally, if you look at at least at the Brazilian Amazon, the amount of deforestation associated with the rivers, it's mostly whitewater rivers, but it's actually much less than what's happened from roads. So 95% of the deforestation is correlated strongly with roads. So roads really do, I mean, I think you will get, I mean, if you could have a scheme in which you could, let's say for the Colombian Amazon, try to use river corridors where possible, and also I think there will be road expansion there, but try to have environmental zoning and planning coming into the process. What you don't want is these roads that go cut way deep, right into the heart of the Amazon, and then a good example, I don't have in a different talk I have a map of it. If you look at the first major highway that went into the Amazon, okay, it's between Belém, which is the city at the mouth of the Amazon, and Brasilia, the national capital. It was built in the early 1970s. It was a big, you know, major road right through the Amazon. That started out as one highway. Today, it is a 400-kilometer wide slash of forest destruction across the eastern Brazilian Amazon. It's a whole spiderweb roads. It's just, you drive along that road and you just, horizon to horizon, you don't hardly see any forest at all. That is what can happen in poorly governed or, you know, inadequately controlled frontier areas like the Brazilian Amazon was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when new roads go in. So I think it's all about talking about planning and prioritization. You probably will have major, now that things are politically more stable in the Amazon.
But it would be better to use the rivers than build roads.
Well, yes, ideally it would. I absolutely agree, but I'm not sure whether there will be strong pressures. I mean, from mining, for instance. Mining provides such a, I don't know about the mineral resources in the Amazon, but timber, other things provide a very powerful economic impetus for road building. That's the first step. That's the first cut. And then it just, Pandora's box opens. Sorry. Okay. There's a question.
Professor Laurance, very interesting lecture. But the real problem at the bottom is this explosive demographic population of the humankind. That's the real problem. Currently, we are growing at a rate that's not sustainable for the planet. But the growing rates of populations are in the undeveloped countries. We are in the middle, but we are not growing so fast like India, But on the other side, it's a fact that the development of the economy also makes that the people moderate the increase in the population. And you have to say that roads also help to the development. It's not an easy compromise.
No.
It's not an easy compromise because the wars need to reduce the rate of the increasing of the human beings. Otherwise, there is no future.
Yeah, and I very much agree with you about the population issue being a very fundamental cause of a lot of the pressures that we're going to face. And I personally don't believe that we're spending nearly as much energy and time talking. And that's another issue that, you know, we tend to talk about immigration problems, we tend to talk about social conflict, we tend to talk about, you know, so many different things. In many cases, those are symptoms, but the disease, as it were, is the population growth, which is so destabilizing. So, and I find that, you know, just in many circles, in academic circles, and journalists, yeah, we don't talk about population enough. So yes, there are relationships between economic development and family sizes and the demographic transition and all this stuff. And I think all I can really say about that is, you know, we clearly need to have more investment in things like education for women, and young women, and economic opportunities, and family planning issues, and things like that. That you know, the key. You've talked to demographers. The key thing they said is if you can have the average age of having the first child, if you can change that from being 18 to 22 or 23, that by itself changes everything. You have smaller family sizes, you have more stable families, you have better economic conditions, you have better education, you have less social conflict. Everything correlates with just delaying the age of the first child. So, you know, but on the other hand, think about some of the societies in the world, you know, some conflicts going on in some of the more fundamentalist parts of the Middle East and Africa. It's going to be a great challenge to try to promote those kinds of changes. But, so it's a roundabout way of saying I agree with you. I think we've got a tremendous challenge ahead. And Nigeria, which is a country that's already facing tremendous social and economic and environmental challenges, is going to have 5 times as many people, not 4 times, going to have 5 times, according to the projections, as many people in Nigeria by the end of the century. I cannot imagine Nigeria with 5 times as many people. And also, we need to convince people in the industrial countries to invest more, because, you know, we're all in this together. Anybody who lives in the United States or lives in Europe or lives in Australia or wherever who thinks that this isn't going to affect them is not paying attention. You know, most of the population growth is happening in the developing countries, but it's going to affect everybody in lots and lots of ways. So I didn't really address your question very well, but Caroline.
Hi, Caroline. Thank you for your talk. I have 2 questions. The first one is about if you take account, or if you are going to take account the climate change vulnerability of some areas. Because, for example, in Colombia, we have an extreme, how do you say that, Niña, and all of our roads were, like 30% or 40% of our roads were destroyed, and we had to develop again. So I would like to know if you're going to take account climate change.
Let me answer that one first.
Okay.
Yes. Well, we didn't incorporate it into our model, but we did say in the paper that when people are doing their projections of where agricultural priority areas should be, that there are models out there which try to look at how, there were 2 issues. One is how climates could change in the future, of which really we have a great deal of uncertainty about some things, especially rainfall. But there are attempts to try to project that. And the other is areas that have a lot of just natural climatic variability. For instance, the Sahel comes out as an area where it looks like there's a lot of opportunity, Sahel being below in Central Africa, Equatorial Africa. But that Sahel region also has a lot of between-year variation in climate, and that could be a real problem for agriculture. So I think, I take your point, that the climate issues have to be considered carefully when people are thinking about investments for road building and for agricultural improvements. So yes, we know it's important. It's not incorporated into our model, but we're saying that when people want to do more detailed things, that they do need to consider that.
And the second one is, as you know, Colombia is now in an historical moment because we are trying to have our peace in our country. And we are developing like post-conflict scenarios. So what would you recommend to our government that, as you see, we are a megadiversity country. So, and we are trying to develop, we are trying to design some territories for the post-conflict. And so what would be your recommendation to our government in this historical moment?
Yeah, well, and Colombia is very much in a historical time, and I think that that's what you're seeing now is a tremendous, really increase in development activity, mining activity, infrastructure activity, agriculture in many parts of the country. And I think that this is precisely the time where strategic environmental planning, and I know that there's groups like the Humboldt Institute and many others that are involved in a lot of these issues. But what I would in fact say that this is really an ideal, in fact a critical time to try to bring these planning frameworks in. Because otherwise what will happen, which is really almost the norm in many places, is it'll just be chaotic development. It'll just be driven by many different factors, but it won't be planned very well. And that can result in some very serious environmental problems. So I think that's, an area where scientists can hopefully have an influence on the dialogue and say, look, we understand that there's great challenges here and that there's many forces that are deciding these things, but at least we need to have a voice and a seat at the table and to be able to be an active part of the process, because otherwise there will be, I think, very, very serious environmental damage. And Colombia is obviously changing very rapidly. Everyone around the world knows that Colombia is just changing very dramatically right now with all this development.
Have you calculated how much worth to keep these green areas or the conflict areas? How much worth to leave these areas without roads compared, for instance, to having roads?
How much land area?
No. How much, like, you need to say that this is good, but you need to say in terms of money.
Oh,
because how much worth to have that area,
right,
like without roads compared to having a road?
Yeah.
Because, well, if you're going to combine somebody, you need to say, okay, this is good because this is going to saving us.
Yeah.
How much? I don't know.
Yeah.
How much? But
No, we have not. The environmental services and values that we have are all relative, and the agricultural things are all relative. So you could try to monetize that. You could try to place values. It would probably be easier to place the values on the agricultural side of things because we have agricultural commodities and we know what these things are worth and we know what they're, we can value those. Environmental services, of course, there's a whole bunch of many people in many parts of the world trying to create values, or right now we have markets for carbon, which we're not terribly successful at, but people have been trying. And there's other kinds of environmental services too, but those are more difficult to monetize, to value. So at this point, it's all relative. But you could, when you start talking about specific roads, like you could say, okay, we want to put in this road, and there's been enough work on roads now that we could say, okay, that road is likely to cause 2 million hectares of additional deforestation and forest degradation, and at least for the carbon, it would be worth this much at the current market price. So you could then say, well, if you want to use red funding, and the government says, okay, we will not build that road if the world pays us, $4 billion. In fact, this kind of thing has been happening in Gasuni National Park in Ecuador. The government said, pay us $350 million. It was 350, is that right? Huh? Billion. Okay, no, it was several billion. Yes. Yeah. So 350 million was raised, I think, or something like that. But anyway, so it was, the government said, pay us several $billion and we will not build a road to exploit the natural oil at the Gasuni. The problem is that the numbers become very high for valuable resources. And that's just the way that we value things. So we value oil as being very valuable, and trees, biodiversity, carbon, right now, is less. But you could, in theory, monetize this whole exercise. We have not.
Si no hay más preguntas, creo que nos llevamos una gran impresión de lo que nos espera. Colombia está ubicado en varios colorcitos no tan agradables. Estamos ubicados en la zona de crisis, según el planteamiento del doctor Laurance. Creo que los que estamos relacionados con la conservación y la docencia aquí tenemos un papel importante en hacer caer al país nacional en este impacto que significarán las carreteras y los procesos de desarrollo para nuestro país. Entonces, desde la academia tenemos una labor muy grande en la divulgación de esta información y sobre todo proponer alternativas. Bill, muchas gracias por tu charla. Bienvenido nuevamente a la universidad y es un placer tenerte aquí. Gracias. Vamos a esperar 5 minutos y daremos inicio a la conferencia del día de hoy. Buenos días nuevamente. Antes de comenzar les agradezco colocar sus celulares en modo silencioso o apagarlos para poder disfrutar de nuestra charla de hoy. Es muy agradable dentro de los invitados especiales contar hoy con la conferencia del doctor Bill Laurance. Esta conferencia se da en ocasión a la visita del doctor Laurance al país y se relaciona con un proyecto de investigación doctoral de uno de nuestros exalumnos que actualmente es alumno de él, la Mapa, y aprovechamos esa presencia y esos contactos para que el doctor nos pudiera brindar una charla que en el mensaje se titulaba Mapa mundial de carreteras, una estrategia para la construcción de vías amigables con el ambiente. Todos los que hemos tenido algo que ver alguna vez con ecología del paisaje, fragmentación, hemos leído uno o varios documentos de nuestro conferencista invitado. Sin embargo, me voy a permitir hacer una breve reseña el historial académico y los temas de investigación del doctor Laurance. El doctor es profesor e investigador distinguido en la Universidad de James Cook, Australia, titular de la cátedra Príncipe Berman en Natural Conservation Internacional en la Universidad de Utrecht de los Países Bajos. También es investigador asociado en la Universidad de Harvard y en el Smithsonian. La investigación del profesor se centra en los impactos de los diferentes usos de la tierra, la fragmentación del hábitat, la tala y los incendios forestales, los bosques y las especies tropicales, así como el cambio climático y la política de conservación. El profesor Laurance ha publicado 5 libros y más de 300 artículos científicos y populares. Es miembro de la Asociación Americana para el Avance de la Ciencia y fue presidente de la Asociación para la Biología Tropical y Conservación. Esta es la mayor organización científica mundial dedicada al estudio y conservación de los ecosistemas tropicales. Además, durante su trayectoria científica ha recibido varios reconocimientos científicos, entre ellos los premios Frontera de BBVA en Ecología y Biología de la Conservación. Los temas de conservación en un país como nuestro son temas cotidianos, temas de planificación. Como saben ustedes, el país está en este momento afrontado al desarrollo de las autopistas 4G, estamos haciendo una gran inversión en varios kilómetros de carreteras, más o menos de 8.000 kilómetros. Entonces, este reto de invertir y buscar un desarrollo en un país megadiverso, creo que la charla del profesor Laurance nos dará algunas luces y sobre todo generará inquietudes para los que estamos interesados en los temas de conservación en nuestro país. La charla se dictará en inglés. Las preguntas al final serán traducidas si fuese necesario. Gracias.
Ok, muchas gracias, Hugo, por esa introducción. Estoy muy feliz para visitar la Universidad aquí. Es mi segunda vez aquí en Colombia. Visitamos con mi estudiante Leonardo de Meta, en varias áreas de Andes, muchos lugares súper lindos. Muy feliz para ver esas áreas increíbles. Como Hugo mencionó, voy a hacer esta charla en inglés. Yo podría intentar en español, pero no sé, probablemente después de 10-15 minutos voy a comenzar torturando ustedes con mi español. Mi portugués es mejor que mi español. Y el otro problema es más lento, es un poco grande presentación. Puedo hacer en español 3.5 horas más o menos. Probablemente mejor para hacer en inglés. So, I hope that is okay to talk about some of these issues in English. So, this study is about roads and about the global impact of roads. And roads are an issue that I've been harping on about for a long time, as have many other people, because we really think that roads are extremely important in determining the environmental impacts around the world. Hugo mentioned that by the middle part of this century, we expect to have about another 25 million kilometers of new roads, and that's enough. That's paved roads, by the way. There's going to be a lot more illegal roads or unofficial roads happening as well on top of that. But just the paved roads are going to be enough to go around the world more than 600 times. So we're really talking about an incredible transformation of the world in a lot of ways. And the other thing that's really striking about this is almost all, about 90% of the new road building is going to be in developing countries. And of course, these are nations that have tremendous, in many cases, many are tropical, many have extremely high biodiversity, have very high environmental services. And so, and I'm sure if you just, you look around in South America, for instance, in Central America, you see roads, new roads, happening everywhere. It's an avalanche, it's a tsunami of change. Here's one example. Now, the Congo Basin is an area that I've always tended to think of as a great wilderness. If you read Joseph Conrad, The Heart of Darkness, you talk about the dark continent of Africa, this great wilderness. But in fact, if you use satellite images to look at places like the Congo Basin that we tend to think of as this great wilderness, in fact, we see many, many roads all through the Congo. Those are just the major roads. And in fact, even if we start looking in at some areas that don't look like they have very many roads, and we start looking at higher resolution, we in fact see that there's many smaller roads for logging operations. So there's been an explosion of road building in the Congo. One study showed that there was more than 50,000 kilometers of new roads built in the Congo Basin over a 3-year period. And we see a similar pattern in many other parts of the world, including many of the world's last surviving wilderness areas. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about what roads do to biodiversity and to ecosystems, and then talk about a plan, a scheme that we have in PRESS, which is trying to ask where should roads go on the earth and where should roads not go on the earth. So when we talk about the impacts of roads, we can really think of 2 basic categories of effects. One are the direct impacts, and the other are the indirect impacts. So I'll start off by talking about the direct effects of roads. So the first obvious thing is habitat loss. When you create a road, typically what happens is that they do what's called cutting and filling. They cut the higher parts of the topography, and they use the earth, or what they remove, to fill in the lower parts of the topography. And as they do that, it destroys some habitat. You can see here, this is a mining operation, a road for a mining operation in Panama. And you can see here's a road and it's verges here. So this is probably 30 or 40 meters across here. So there's some habitat, direct habitat loss that's destroyed by road construction itself. Also, of course, I think most people are familiar with the impacts of habitat fragmentation and the fact that you get edge effects. When you create a road, you create an environment that is physically very different from the forest itself. The road is going to have much higher, it's going to be much warmer, it's going to be much more exposed to wind and to solar radiation and to other kinds of factors. And so there's a very strong physical difference between the road surface itself and the adjoining vegetation, and especially if that's something like a tropical rainforest. For many years I've been working in the central Amazon in Manaus at a forest fragmentation project there, and one of the things that we've studied are edge effects. And so these are the ecological changes associated with these abrupt and artificial boundaries, in this case between cattle pastures and between forest. And you can see, so this is the edge of the forest right here, and this is going further and further into the forest, 100 meters, 200 meters, etc. And you can just see how diverse, how remarkably varied the different edge effects are. There are microclimatic changes, there are changes in disturbance regimes, there's changes in forest structure, there's changes in faunal communities. There are all kinds of changes that are happening associated with these abrupt and artificial forest edges, like those that are being created by road building. This is one example of some of these edge effects. So these are, if you look at understory birds, these are birds that live in the understory of the forest, many of them eat insects, you find that there are a number of groups, a number of guilds that are very sensitive to roads. For instance, you can see these terrestrial species and also solitary understory species. And this is a transect line. This is from my wife's PhD project in the central Amazon. This is mistnet lines that are 10 meters from the road, 70 meters from the road, 130 meters of the road. And you can see there's a substantial decline in the abundances of these birds as you get closer and closer to the roads. Something about the roads and the light and the conditions seem to be very foreign to the birds. And many of them don't even hesitate to cross the roads, but in many cases don't even like to go near the roads at all or near forest clearings. There are hydrological impacts. It doesn't matter almost how many culverts you put in, how many tunnels underneath the road for the water.